Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Hide your kids, hide your wives, hide your husbands, turn the volume down so the neighbors don't hear, because we're going to spend the next 30-ish minutes or so talking about ball catchers. If you're in the fantasy playoffs, you're probably feeling really good about the running back position because in 2024, running backs felt locked in. We didn't have a big carousel like we've experienced like the last few years. It was wide receivers this year that seemed to give people the most problems, trying to lock in that consistency at the position. So here in week 15, this is going to be one of the most important weeks yet. Hit that like button, lock yourself in, because we need to figure out who your starting wide receivers need to be. And hopefully Thursday night football this week is not a gigantic snooze fest, because we're going to have some wide receivers for the Rams and the 49ers that we need to pop off. Now, even though San Francisco is allowing the third fewest receiving yards to wide receivers this season, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua both need to be locked in as starters on your team. Now, Puka Nacua is the safest of the two. He also has the highest upside right now. We're looking at a guy that his floor is like high-end wide receiver 2 with a really solid wide receiver 1 ceiling every single week, where Cooper Kupp's floor tends to go a little bit closer to the low-end wide receiver 2 area, and really his ceiling is right around that 14 to 10 mark in terms of top wide receivers. The LA Rams defense, though, has definitely given up a whole lot more to wide receivers this season. They're allowing the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and they are tied for the 3rd most touchdowns allowed. The safest bet outside of George Kittle in this offense right now is Jauan Jennings. He has completely overtaken the wide receiver position this season for San Francisco, and he has earned himself a really nice, solid fantasy floor every single game. Debo's the bigger problem right now, and I'm going to list him as a medium risk because this guy, the drops are not good right now. He's not picking up yards after the catch like he used to, and he's just not playing the same type of football. And now he's on Twitter blaming the team for not getting him enough targets. I don't know if that's going to make things better or worse, but right now he just does not have the upside that he used to. I'm really hoping DeAndre Hopkins can have a solid day this week going up against Cleveland. He hasn't really been able to hit top 12 numbers, even though he has 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games, but he does have 9 targets in back-to-back games. Cleveland is allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game, and they're tied for the 5th most touchdowns allowed to wide receivers, while allowing the 8th most receiving yards on the season. So DeAndre Hopkins, to me, has a safer floor this week, but some of it depends on Jameis Winston. If he shows up and he plays well and he keeps his game competitive for Cleveland without turning the ball over too much, neutral game script could end up being DeAndre Hopkins' best friend. But it also could end up being the best friend for the Cleveland wide receivers as well, because it might take volume this week. And we've seen that in games where Cleveland is neutral or they are trailing. They're throwing the ball an awful lot. These guys are all getting double-digit targets per game. And even with Kansas City allowing the 7th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, 10, 11, 12 targets for Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, and maybe even Cedric Tillman if he ends up coming back this week could definitely be a big help to making him fantasy viable. Now, Jerry Jeudy is the safest bet. Over the last 4 weeks, he has 2 top 12 performances and 2 top 24 performances. So for him, he's the guy with the best floor and the highest ceiling. Now, Elijah Moore doesn't have the same type of ceiling as Jeudy, but he does have a couple of top 24 performances over the last 4 weeks. Cedric Tillman is really going to be the question mark, and as of right now, there is no guaranteed word on whether or not he will be playing this week. If he does, to me, I feel like he's got a lower floor than Elijah Moore, but he does end up having a little bit higher ceiling than Jerry Jeudy. But he's riskier than Jerry Jeudy because he's going to be a little bit more reliant on that big play. Tennessee's defense, a little bit banged up, and they don't seem to be as elite as they were at the beginning of the season, but they're still playing very well because at this point of the year, they're still allowing the fewest receiving yards and 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Now, that doesn't bother me with Ja'Marr Chase. The dude's the wide receiver 1 and absolutely balling out looking for that new contract. And Joe Burrow is putting up MVP-like numbers. Unfortunately, their record sucks, so he's not getting nearly the recognition that he should. And of course, the one thing that helps is that their defense is terrible, so they're consistently throwing the football. Now, T. Higgins, he's going to be a little bit riskier because this matchup is tougher. He's a guy who, in really good matchups, he should thrive. But in tougher matchups, it may be a little bit harder for him to find that ceiling. Cincinnati's defense allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Like I said, they struggle this season to stop opposing teams. Here's the issue with Tennessee, though. They had a great matchup last week against Jacksonville and absolutely crap the bed, for lack of a better word. They couldn't get anything done against Jacksonville. Calvin Ridley could not get his revenge game, and NWI completely disappeared. Now, not really their fault. It was more along the lines of what happened with the quarterback position, and we are still waiting to hear what will happen this week. It appears to be Mason Rudolph, so I don't know. Maybe he'll get back to throwing NWI some more targets, get him back into the end zone. Calvin Ridley, though, should see the majority of the targets this week, and since it is against a poor defense once again, we just have to hope that they build up more than enough volume to help carry some of that ceiling that we just missed out on last week. I think we can go ahead and lock in Terry McLaurin for a very solid fantasy day. The New Orleans Saints defense is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game and 5th most receiving yards to wide receivers. I am worried about Terry McLaurin's ceiling, however, this week. The matchup itself presents a really solid floor. But how early does Washington walk away with this game? If they do, we're going to be starting a backup quarterback once again for New Orleans, and they're still completely banged up all over the place. Are they going to be able to remain competitive? And if so, for how long? Because if we get to the second half and Washington is up by multiple scores, we may not see a whole lot of Terry McLaurin, and his ceiling could disappear very fast. And while Washington is tied for the 5th most receiving touchdowns allowed to wide receivers, without Derek Carr throwing him the football, I don't know if we need to risk MVS this week. He's been a guy that has had a solid ceiling, but it's been a ceiling that's been pushed by big plays and touchdowns. And with a backup quarterback in, I don't know if realistically we want to try and go that route. If you've been starting MVS, I would probably back off of that this week and maybe look for a safer option. Baltimore's coming out of the bye with an opportunity to get back on track against one of the NFL's worst teams, the New York Giants. And the last time we saw Baltimore in action, they lost a close matchup with the Philadelphia Eagles. But I'm a little bit more concerned with the performance we've seen from Zay Flowers as of recent. The highest finish that he has had over the last 4 games is wide receiver 31. But targets aren't really an issue because during that time frame, he's had 6, 6, 8, and 7 targets. So the fantasy upside that we saw earlier in the year has kind of dissipated a little bit. Now, in the games where he was finishing as a wide receiver 1, he was typically seeing double-digit targets. And really, a lot of that may have stemmed from the fact that Lamar Jackson was not looking towards Mark Andrews, and now he's looking that way a little bit more often. It really doesn't have a whole lot to do with Deontay Johnson, and if it did, Deontay Johnson is suspended this week, so maybe it does help Zay Flowers. I am a little bit concerned. This isn't the easiest matchup in the world. The New York Giants do allow the 8th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, and we've seen some of those targets start to dip down a little bit. But what I really need to see from Zay Flowers is some bigger plays. And there's been a couple of games where Lamar Jackson has barely missed Zay Flowers for those big plays. So maybe they can connect this week. Baltimore is allowing the 3rd most receiving yards, 4th most receiving touchdowns, and the most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. So I think I speak for everybody out there that has Malik Nabers on their team. Get the ball to your playmaker this week as much as you possibly can. Not only that, but can we get Wan'Dale Robinson a few more targets this week as well? Both of these guys would be a great help. Malik Nabers is going to be low risk for me because he's the playmaker. He's the guy that continues to see quite a bit of targets and has the biggest play upside. Wan'Dale Robinson could get 10 targets in a game. He could catch 8 of those, and he may only have 50 yards. So for Wan'Dale Robinson, he's definitely way better in a PPR league. But in a half PPR league, if you're looking to flex somebody because you have multiple flex spots, Wan'Dale Robinson this week could still work out pretty well. CeeDee Lamb had his first top 12 performance since week 8 this past week going up against Cincinnati. It was great to see him show a little bit more of the ceiling that we knew was there, but with Cooper Rush, he just wasn't finding. But even though he hasn't been able to find that ceiling, the floor has still been solid because he has 3 wide receiver 2 performances at least over the last 4 games. Now, Carolina has been playing much better right now than they were earlier in the season, and they are still allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Now, CeeDee Lamb is a low-risk start for me this week. He doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world, and I don't know if he'll be a wide receiver 1 this week, but he definitely could still be locked in as a wide receiver 2 because the targets have been plenty for him. Now, Carolina is favored to win this game as of this recording, and maybe that ends up changing, and a favorable game script for them is not something that we want to see for Adam Thielen. Now, Xavier Legette, I'm not really interested in tossing him to my lineup unless you absolutely need some sort of a big play shot. Maybe you're one of the lower seeds playing one of the top seeds and you need somebody in your lineup that could have a big day. Legette may have a couple of big plays here or there, but Adam Thielen is going to have the best upside with the safest floor. He's going to receive a decent amount of targets. He had 11 last week, and he really feels like the go-to for Bryce Young right now. Best case scenario for those of you that are starting Adam Thielen, Carolina keeps it close or they're losing. Solid days last week for both Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams, and it was sorely needed. Davante Adams with 11 targets. We had Garrett Wilson with 10 targets. Both of them went over 100 yards. Adams scored, and now they're going up against Jacksonville that allows the 4th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. Getting these guys both to that type of level again this week would definitely be great for fantasy owners that are in the playoffs and relying on either of these guys to be a big part of this stretch run to secure a fantasy title. Now, I knew I wanted a little bit of the action when it came to the New York Jets offense going up against Jacksonville this week. Listen, Jacksonville shutting down Tennessee last week had nothing to do with Jacksonville and everything to do with Tennessee. So I definitely think the Jets are in some safe territory this week to put up some decent numbers. So when I headed on over to Underdog and I took a look at the projections, Garrett Wilson is actually projected for a few less yards than Davante Adams. So I'm deciding to go with Garrett Wilson's numbers this week because right now he's projected for 62.5 receiving yards. He went over 100 yards last week and has a great opportunity to do it once again this week. If you're feeling spicy and you want to put in a ticket with even higher numbers than that, then use it to change it, bump those numbers up and change that multiplier a little bit. But for me personally, I think he goes over those projections. I'm going higher. Now, the Jets defense is also banged up a little bit, but they've still been pretty solid against the pass this season. They're allowing the 4th fewest receiving yards and fantasy points per game and the 2nd fewest touchdowns to wide receivers so far in 2024. Now, Brian Thomas Jr., he hasn't had the upside that we saw earlier in the season, but the floor hasn't been bad recently either. Over his last 3 games with Mac Jones, he has at least 76 receiving yards in every single game and 29 total targets over that span. So we know Brian Thomas Jr. is still getting looked at. Now, he is a little bit riskier going up against the Jets this week, but the floor that we've seen from him the last 3 games is probably his ceiling this week, and that still isn't bad. The Miami offense is starting to click and they're starting to get hot, which this is the right time for them to do it as they make a run to a potential postseason berth after really just being up and down and looking awful at the beginning of the season. And Tyreek Hill getting hot at the right time is also great for fantasy owners. Back-to-back wide receiver 1 weeks for the first time all season, and he finally went over 100 yards again last week and had a touchdown against the Jets. Houston is allowing the 2nd most receiving touchdowns and the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And I'm all in on Tyreek Hill having another solid fantasy day this week. In fact, over on Underdog, his current projection is only 72.5 receiving yards, and he's gone over that in each of the last 2 games. So I'm definitely willing to buy in to him going over that number once again. So I'll go higher than that projection. Waddle has shown a little bit of life as well. He's used the wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 16 in 2 of the last 3 games. But really, he's volume dependent. He needs close to double-digit targets to be able to hit those numbers. If he doesn't get close to double-digit targets, unfortunately, he hasn't been showing the upside to be a potential high-end wide receiver 2 without him. Nico Collins has over 200 receiving yards combined the last 2 weeks, and he's showing a lot of that big playability that he had earlier in the season when he was leading the league in receiving yards. The biggest issue for me this week going up against Miami, who still allows the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, is the fact that his floor and his ceiling are probably wider than what they have been at any point this year. Throughout a majority of the season, his ceiling and his floor have been really close together. We really knew what we were going to be getting from Nico Collins really every single week. But in this matchup, I definitely feel like the gap is a whole lot wider. And that's why he's a medium risk for me instead of being a low risk. If this was a little bit of a better matchup, I would be bringing that floor and that ceiling together a little bit more. But the range of outcomes is just a lot more than what we're used to. The Indianapolis analysis is really going to depend on whether or not Josh Downs plays this week. If he does play, then we're going to be looking him at a potential medium risk starter. If he doesn't end up playing, then I don't know if anybody else becomes a medium risk, but we're going to have to talk about a couple of guys that may see a couple of big plays here or there. So we're going to have to wait really until the rankings come out to adjust ourselves to find out what's going to be happening with Josh Downs. And of course, we'll be talking about that over the live show weekend. So make sure you tune into the live show and check that out to see what we have to say about updates later in the week. Denver's allowing the fewest receiving touchdowns to wide receivers. And really, we've seen with the wide receivers for Indianapolis this year be very big play dependent and very touchdown dependent. So if there's no Josh Downs in this matchup, the one guy that has racked up a decent amount of volume, I'm not feeling good about any of these guys. Now, there is one guy for Denver that it feels like we've been able to consistently rely on. And I'll be honest, I didn't think we were going to be able to at the start of the season. Courtland Sutton has definitely played well, and he's been a mainstay in our fantasy lineups. And in this matchup, going up against Indianapolis, I definitely would make sure that he finds his way into my lineup once again. Buffalo and Detroit is going to be a massive game this week. There's so many fantasy implications and real life playoff implications that are going to be taking place in Detroit. And Khalil Shakir is coming off his biggest game of the season. And that's why Khalil Shakir is going to be my Turtle Beach level up your game wide receiver of the week. Going up against a Detroit secondary that even though they're starting to get healthy, they're allowing the second most receiving yards to wide receivers right now. The one thing that we've seen from Khalil Shakir all season long is a pretty solid floor. He hasn't had the most upside in the world, but when we play him, we're getting a guy giving us low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 numbers. If we're flexing Khalil Shakir, we're feeling okay about it. But last week, going up against the Rams in a shootout, he finally saw his first wide receiver 1 performance of the season. And now he could be finding himself in a very similar game on the road going up against Detroit. Now, Detroit's defensive line has been banged up, and as of this recording, it does seem like that they're going to be close to full health again, obviously missing a couple of guys, but who they've had over the past few weeks. If that happens, Josh Allen is going to be needing to get the ball out quickly, and Khalil Shakir will be the guy that he's going to be looking towards. So I do think that he has an opportunity to level up his game once again this week. And if you need to level up your gaming experience, the only place to do it is through Turtle Beach. And right now, by going over to their website and using code Headliners, you're going to get 10% off your entire order over there. So whether you need to grab yourself a new mouse or keyboard or gaming headset, this is going to be the way to do it. Or maybe you need to get some gifts still for those loved ones in your life that are gamers. Help them level up their game this holiday season by using Turtle Beach. And I'll tell you, my friends won't admit it, but since I switched to Turtle Beach, I've leveled up my game and I'm carrying all of them right now. And you know what? Maybe it's not a good thing that I'm going all in on Khalil Shakir this week since he is playing my Lions, but I'm also going to go to underdog where his current projection is 59.5 receiving yards. And I'm going to go ahead and slip him into my underdog lineups, going higher than that projection as well. Now, obviously, the Detroit wide receivers will need to make an impact in this game, but how big of an impact? Are they going to just kind of be like part of the storyline? And really, we're going to be watching David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs take care of Buffalo? Or are we going to see some bigger plays than what we've seen over the last few weeks? Buffalo is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position right now. And Amon-Ra St. Brown has had a really low ceiling here as of recent, finishing as the wide receiver 29, 35, and 36 over the last 3 weeks. Now, he's still seeing a decent amount of work, but the problem is he's not seeing a lot of big plays past the sticks. Amon-Ra St. Brown is being utilized in this Detroit offense for what he's really good for right now, and that's getting to the first down marker, picking up those tough yards. That's what Amon-Ra St. Brown does well. Jameson Williams hasn't seen a ton of big plays as of recent, but if there was going to be a game where both of these guys broke out again, it would be going up against Buffalo. They might just be a little bit more risky than normal. With no George Pickens this week and going up against a defense currently allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game and 2nd fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, I can't find myself buying into any wide receiver from the Pittsburgh Steelers. And really, the Eagles wide receivers may not be a ton safer because Pittsburgh's defense is only allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. So when you take a look at like A.J. Brown this week, he may not have the ceiling that we're used to. He's still going to have a decent floor because he's going to get the majority of the targets in any type of a close game, where Devontae Smith will be much riskier because he's going to have a big play or maybe even a touchdown along with it to make his fantasy day viable. I'm feeling like the New England-Arizona matchup could be highly volatile at the wide receiver position. Like, Demario Douglas and Marvin Harrison Jr. could end up having solid days, and there could be a couple of guys that no one's starting anyway that maybe catches a touchdown pass. But like, you take a look at Demario Douglas, and he's very similar to Wan'Dale Robinson. You know, he'll get a few targets, he'll catch a few balls, and really he doesn't have that high of a ceiling. He'll put together, like, if he catches 6 balls in a game, maybe he'll give you 50 receiving yards or something along those lines. Now, he is a little bit of a higher ceiling with Drake May, but Drake May spreads the ball around a little bit more than what Jacoby Brissett did when Demario Douglas was healthy. So he could definitely have a solid floor, and if you're looking for a safer play, Demario Douglas kind of falls into that realm. Now, New England is allowing the 10th most touchdowns and receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. So maybe Marvin Harrison Jr. uses this opportunity to kind of get back on track, but he's been very up and down and for the most part, very disappointing so far this season. In fact, when it comes to big games, he really hasn't had a whole lot. Since week 8, he has not had more than 100 receiving yards. In fact, since week 8, his high is 60 receiving yards. And Michael Wilson was a top 24 wide receiver for the first time all season last week, and that was with a touchdown. So Marvin Harrison Jr., hopefully he gets back on track. If you own him, you're probably putting him in your lineup because given the matchup, you may not have very many players that have more upside than what he does. Since coming back from the bye and his injury, Mike Evans only has one top 12 performance over the last 3 weeks. The other 2 games, he finished outside the top 24 wide receivers. And we could see that same type of volatile performance this week going up against a very stout Chargers defense. Now, Mike Evans should be targeted more than anybody in this matchup. However, Jalen McMillan, after scoring 2 touchdowns last week, may be looked at in the red zone this week as well. So I'm going to list him as a medium risk because I don't think Tampa Bay walks away with this game. And if they don't have Bucky Irving this week and Rachaad White has trouble moving the football, Baker may have to do it himself. The Tampa Bay defense, though, is giving up the 9th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. We know that if Ladd McConkey plays, he's going to eat in this matchup, but we don't know if he's going to be healthy and ready to go by the end of the week as of yet. Now, if you're looking for a high upside risk play, Quentin Johnston scoring a touchdown is not out of the question this week, and Josh Palmer is only fantasy viable if Ladd McConkey is out. This matchup could be an absolute disaster for the Green Bay wide receivers, and it really comes at the absolute worst time because right now trying to figure out what wide receiver is going to do anything in Green Bay is almost impossible. And now Seattle, going up against Green Bay, allowing the 9th fewest receiving yards to the position, could make matters even worse. Now, over the last 4 games, Christian Watson has kind of become the wide receiver one. He has 2 100-yard games, and he went for 67 yards in another one of those games. But we know he's very risky, and we know the chances of him getting injured are always high. Jayden Reed absolutely disappeared last week against Detroit. Only 1 target. In the 3 games coming into that game, he had 3 touchdowns over that span, but his high receiving yards was only 26 yards. Since Green Bay has come out of the bye, Jayden Reed has been awful. And really the safest wide receiver is Romeo Doubs, and he's still in the concussion protocol as of this recording, which is not good news considering the fact that this would be the 3rd week he would be in the protocol. So really for me, I don't know if I want to risk it with any of these guys. If Romeo Doubs ends up playing and you want the safest bet out of this group, it's Romeo Doubs. If you're looking for the highest upside play out of this group, it's Christian Watson. And if you want to start Jayden Reed, be my guest, because one of 2 outcomes is going to happen with him. You're either going to hate yourself for starting him and you're going to throw your phone in the nearest dumpster, or you're going to be popping champagne and sending donations to his favorite charity as a thank you for winning your week. Now, even though Green Bay is allowing the 5th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, I still feel really good about Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's obviously the wide receiver one in this offense, and he has shown that over the last several weeks. In fact, over his last 6 games, he's had at least 69 receiving yards in every single game, and he's getting a decent amount of targets. So his floor, even in half PPR leagues, is still really solid. The one guy that I have an issue with, outside of the soapbox I was just on about Green Bay, is DK Metcalf. Now, I'm going to read you some stats about DK Metcalf because by the end of this segment, you may think I'm a little bit crazy, and that's yet to be seen. So I'm going to be looking off camera here for a minute as I read you some of these things to really come to the conclusion that I'm drawing about this segment. So back at the beginning of the season, through week 7, DK Metcalf only had 3 wide receiver one performances. The other games, he was barely even fantasy viable. In week 1, wide receiver 63. Didn't do anything for you. Wide receiver 28 in week 4 against Detroit. Not bad wide receiver 3 flex play. But then wide receiver 52 and wide receiver 49 the weeks after that. So even at the beginning of the season, trying to play DK Metcalf was as risky as it got as any wide receiver in the NFL. But then he got hurt. And then in week 8, he didn't play. Week 9, he didn't play. They had the bye week in week 10. He was healthy coming into week 11. Now, if he's healthy, that's great. If he's not healthy, then maybe that's the reason some of these numbers look the way that they do. Because DK Metcalf, at best, has been a high-risk flex option for you since the bye. He's been the wide receiver 32, 37, 39, and 44. In fact, since the bye, he's gotten worse every single week. And now he's going up against a defense that has done a decent job at limiting wide receivers this season. So maybe this is me being a little bit too spicy this week. Maybe it's me coming to the realization that DK Metcalf just isn't the guy in this offense right now, and he may not be the rest of the season. Maybe it's the fact that Geno Smith hasn't had a whole lot of upside either, and you'll hear more about that in the quarterback video. But DK Metcalf is going to be my Mando must-avoid wide receiver for the week. I'm staying away from DK Metcalf this week if I can. And it might be super risky for some of you to do that, but this is a guy that has gone 70, 59, 66, and 49 receiving yards, hasn't scored a touchdown since week 7, only has 3 touchdowns on the entire season, isn't even the number 1 target in his offense anymore. Seattle's going to run the football, and oh yeah, it's a pretty solid matchup for Noah Fant as well, who's back from injury. Now, if you have to start DK Metcalf this week, you may be sweating it out, and if you are, you could use help from our friends over at Mando, whose clinically proven 72-hour formula can help defeat odors and keep you smelling absolutely fresh. So when you're done sweating it out and watching DK Metcalf, you can go about your day and no one's going to have to know that, yeah, you started DK Metcalf. And right now, if you use code word headliners over on Shop Mando, you're gonna get $5 off of their starter pack, which is essentially 40% off the price. So make sure you get that ordered right now, so hopefully you can get it before Sunday. But even over on Underdog, DK Metcalf's current projection sits at 65.5 receiving yards. Over the last 4 games, he's only gone over that twice. And one of those 2 games, he had 66 receiving yards. I'm going to go under that number this week. And if DK Metcalf absolutely explodes and he's not in your lineup, my bad, Headliner Nation. But all of the evidence and all of the stats support the fact that DK Metcalf just isn't the same guy that we've been accustomed to starting over the last few years. This should be a smash start for at least one of the Chicago wide receivers, but trying to figure out which one is going to be the question mark in this matchup, because Minnesota's defense is allowing the most receiving yards and second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But the wide receivers are just up and down. I mean, Keenan Allen had 2 super solid games, and he looked like he was going to just explode the rest of the season, and then he disappeared last week. And DJ Moore looked like him and Caleb Williams were going to end up being on the same page, but he continues to be up and down. And Rome Odunze was the top wide receiver for a few games, and then he disappeared, and then now he scored 2 touchdowns last week. I think you get the point. Like, if you're trying to start any of these guys, you know that you're taking quite a bit of risk. Now, DJ Moore to me is the safest of this group because I still think he's the wide receiver 1 in this offense. Keenan Allen to me would be number 2, and Rome Odunze would be number 3, and he would be the guy that would need to have the touchdown. Now, just a few weeks ago, Jordan Addison was the wide receiver 1, not a wide receiver 1, the wide receiver 1 against this same Chicago Bears secondary that's still allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. He's still going to be a medium risk for me right now. Justin Jefferson's going to be the main target. He's going to be the guy in this offense, with Jordan Addison definitely having some big play potential, but Chicago may be paying more attention to him this week, so maybe the ceiling isn't nearly as high. But he's on fire right now, and even though he's a medium risk, more than likely he's still in your lineup because the floor should be in the top 24 area. Atlanta and Las Vegas, and I don't know if there's a true safe wide receiver in this matchup. It should be Drake London, it could be Jakobi Meyers, and even Darnell Mooney should be, but Kirk Cousins is playing like absolute crap right now, and trying to rely on him on Monday Night Football, where yes, he's got this stigma where he just doesn't perform well in prime time, and he hasn't been playing well as of recent. That's going to lead to quite a bit of volatility against Drake London and Darnell Mooney, and trying to put them into our fantasy lineups and knowing that the ceiling will absolutely be there, but being very worried about where the floor actually is. Because all of a sudden last week, Ray McCloud ended up leading the team in targets, and that's not something we want to see. We want those targets going to Drake London and Darnell Mooney. And even though Darnell Mooney had a solid game, like, it could have been even better. Kirk Cousins this week, with a backup quarterback starting in Las Vegas, with Desmond Ridder being the guy, it could end up being Atlanta early and often, and if it is, maybe they don't need to throw all that much in the second half. So while, again, the ceiling is there for these guys, the floor is really the biggest question mark. Jakobi Meyers should be a safe start, and I'm going to recommend that you're probably starting him anyway because his ceiling should be solid. But just like the other guys, with Desmond Ridder starting, who knows where the floor actually lies. Now, Atlanta's defense has had trouble stopping the pass all season long. 6th most receiving yards, 3rd most fantasy points, the most touchdowns allowed to wide receivers. So Jakobi Meyers absolutely has a shot to have a very good game this week. And he does have double-digit targets in each of the last 3 games. So the numbers trend towards him having a decent upside. But if Desmond Ridder can't figure it out, Jakobi Meyers isn't going to be able to figure it out. Yo, Headliner Nation, there you have it. 3 of my 4 start and sit videos, all down and live for you on the channel, so you can start putting together your best fantasy lineup. And hopefully you're feeling good about your lineup, and this video has helped with that a little bit. On your way out, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, make sure you stick around and even turn those bell notifications on so anytime we drop new content or go live, you're gonna know about it right away. I'm off to talk about quarterbacks, but hopefully you all have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.